Alright, this one will be tough. Imagine you have three astronauts sitting inside a spacecraft on the launch pad. They are wearing their spacesuits, the hatch is closed and everything is sealed, but they are not actually going anywhere. The rocket is not even fueled. The engines are not about to start. It is basically just a test. And honestly, for most of the day, the biggest problem is something almost stupid. The radio does not work properly. They keep losing communication with the people outside. They can barely understand each other. And Gus Grissom is getting pretty annoyed by the whole thing. At one point, he basically says, "How are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't even talk between three buildings?" And then, not long after that, somebody inside the spacecraft says, "Fire!" At first, the people outside do not really understand what they are hearing. Then another voice comes through. Now they know this is serious. The crew is trying to get out. People outside start running toward the capsule. And in only a few seconds, what was supposed to be a boring ground test has turned into something nobody was prepared for. And that is the part I found so strange about Apollo 1. The rocket was sitting safely on the ground. It was not going to launch, so how do you lose three astronauts before the mission has even started? Well, to understand that, we need to look at what was actually inside that capsule. The three men were Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. They were preparing for the first crewed Apollo mission. And on January 27, 1967, they were doing what NASA called a plugs out test. That basically means they wanted to see whether the spacecraft could operate on its own power, more or less like it would during an actual launch. So the astronauts climb inside, they close the hatch, and the cabin is filled with oxygen. But not normal air like you and I are breathing right now, but pure oxygen. And, hearing that today immediately sounds dangerous. But at that time, NASA had already used pure oxygen in Mercury and Gemini, and it had worked before. So this was not some crazy new idea where everybody was thinking, "Wow, this seems incredibly risky." It was familiar. And I think that is important because things that work again and again can slowly stop feeling dangerous, even when they still are. Now, pure oxygen does something very unpleasant when there is a fire. Things burn much, much easier. And inside Apollo 1, there was, well, a lot of stuff that could burn. Velcro, nylon, plastic, wire insulation, little pieces of material all around the cabin. And again, none of these things sounds terrifying on its own. You look at some Velcro and you are not thinking, "Oh, this could kill three astronauts." But put all of that inside a small sealed cabin filled with pure oxygen, and suddenly you have a completely different environment. Then, at around 6:31 in the evening, the fire starts. And here is something interesting. Even after the investigation, nobody could say with complete certainty, "This exact wire in this exact place created the first spark." The most likely explanation was some kind of electrical arc. Basically, a small electrical spark somewhere inside the spacecraft. But they never proved the exact starting point. And honestly, after a few seconds, it almost did not matter anymore. Because once the flame found that oxygen-rich cabin, the real problem was how fast everything happened. The fire spreads incredibly quickly, materials start burning, the temperature shoots up, and the pressure inside the capsule starts rising. Now, Ed White, the astronaut in the middle seat, supposed to open the hatch in an emergency. So he starts trying to do exactly that, but Apollo's hatch was not like opening a normal door. It was actually a pretty complicated system with several parts. And the important bit is that the inner hatch opened inward. So even on a normal day, opening this thing was not quick. We're talking something like a minute and a half under good conditions. And the crew had practiced it before. It was never really something where you just grab a handle and jump out. Now add a fire, add smoke, add 3 astronauts in spacesuits, and then add rapidly increasing pressure inside the cabin. Because the hatch opens inward, that pressure is now pushing the hatch closed. So White is trying to pull this door toward himself, while the pressure inside the spacecraft is basically pushing the other way. And at that point, they were not just too slow. The hatch was practically impossible to open. That is what makes this so terrifying. The crew knew they needed to get out. They were trying. People outside were trying to get in. But the spacecraft itself had basically locked them inside. And all of this is happening unbelievably fast. Within seconds of the first call about fire, the pressure rises so much that part of the spacecraft actually ruptures. Flames and hot gas come out onto the launch tower. Now, the people outside have their own problem. They are trying to reach the hatch through smoke so thick they can barely see anything. Some of the masks available to them were meant for dangerous rocket fumes, not really for this kind of fire. So people are basically feeling their way toward the spacecraft, trying to figure out how to get the hatch open. And here's the part that, to me, makes the whole story much worse. NASA had not really prepared for this exact emergency, because remember, this was an unfueled rocket sitting on the ground. The test was not considered especially dangerous, so there was no rescue team standing there waiting for a cabin fire. There was no emergency procedure where everybody knew, okay, if this happened, you have 20 seconds to do this and this, They were trying to solve the problem while it was happening. And by the time they finally got the hatches open, it was too late. The 3 astronauts were gone. Now, after something like this, it is easy to look back and say, well, obviously, pure oxygen was dangerous. Or obviously, the hatch should have opened outward. But that is almost too easy, because before the fire, every individual choice had some explanation. Like pure oxygen had been used before. The hatch had been designed that way for engineering reasons. Velcro was useful inside the cabin. Wires obviously had to be there. And the test was happening on the ground, so people did not treat it like a launch emergency. Nobody sat in the meeting and said, let's build a trap. It happened because several things that looked acceptable on their own ended up sitting next to each other. Then one small spark connected all of them. And after the accident, NASA changed a lot. The hatch was redesigned so it opened outward and could be opened much faster. Flammable material inside the spacecraft was reduced. Wiring was reviewed. Emergency procedures changed. And tests like this were no longer treated as harmless just because the rocket was not going anywhere. But I think the most uncomfortable lesson is actually simpler than all of that. Apollo 1 did not fail because one huge, unbelievable mistake. It fell because too many small things were allowed to depend on everything else going right. The wiring should not spark. The material should not catch fire. The oxygen should not turn that small fire into a huge one. The hatch should be openable. The rescue team should have enough time. If every one of these things works, fine. But on January 27th, 1967, one of them did not. And then suddenly all the others mattered too. 3 astronauts were preparing to fly to space, but the danger that killed them was already waiting inside the spacecraft, while it was still sitting on the ground. And maybe that is the strangest part of Apollo 1. The mission never even began. The test did. So if you want to keep digging into stories like this with me, subscribe to Failure at Last and tell me in the comments, what do you think was the biggest failure here? The design? The test conditions? Or the fact that everyone thought this test was safer than it really was? Thank you for watching and see you in the next one.